They're illegal under international law, yet Israel is expanding its settlements in the occupied West Bank while it wages its war on Gaza. It says they're being established with a long-term strategic vision. But what does that mean for the future of an independent Palestinian state? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Israel says it plans to build 22 new illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank, the largest number to be built in one go. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich says the settlements aim to stop a Palestinian state, while the Israeli army continues its expanded offensive, destroying homes, roads and facilities like waterways and hospitals, essentially making areas of the occupied West Bank unlivable. And settler violence, including destroying crops and uprooting trees, is at an all-time high, according to the UN. Europe has hit back against the move to build more illegal settlements, threatening sanctions. But can they have a real impact? What does this mean for millions of Palestinians? And is a Palestinian state now becoming nearly impossible? We'll get to our panel of guests in just a moment. But first, this report from Imogen Kimber.
Homes and even animal shelters destroyed, and around 50 Palestinians forcibly displaced in just one incident of violence by Israeli settlers in the South Hebron Hills. The UN says the settlers' violence in the occupied West Bank has reached previously unseen levels.
Here in the West Bank, we're witnessing alarming levels of violence. Violence that also leads to demolitions, to forced displacement on a scale that we have not seen before.
Israel itself is also escalating systematic destruction. In January, it launched the largest military operation in the occupied West Bank in decades.
Even if we want to go back to our homes, there are no homes. The camp is uninhabitable because, as you can see what the situation is like, there is no infrastructure, no health services, and no homes.
Organisations like Forensic Architects say Israel's assault on the occupied West Bank echoes its strategy in Gaza: mass destruction, mass displacement. Around 40,000 Palestinians have been forcibly displaced so far. And now, Defence Minister Israel Katz and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich have announced the construction of 22 more illegal settlements, possibly the largest batch at one time, saying they want to prevent a Palestinian state. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party supports what it calls the once-in-a-generation decision to, quote, fortify the east of Israel. Not only do the illegal settlements act as a land grab, but they also further cut off Palestinians. Europeans have condemned Israel's actions, threatened sanctions, and called for a state of Palestine.
Et donc la création d'un État palestinien.
The creation of a Palestinian state must follow the release of hostages, the demilitarization of Hamas, and Hamas not being involved in the governance. It must also be accompanied by a reform of the Palestinian Authority and must be a state that recognizes Israel and its right to live in security. This is not only a moral duty, but a political necessity, and I believe also a realistic approach.
But Israel doesn't appear to change course. Instead, it's systematically destroying life in the occupied West Bank and expanding its illegal settlements and destroying any possibility of an independent Palestinian state. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in today's guests, and joining us in Amman in Jordan, Xavier Abu Eid, political analyst and a former advisor to the PLO's negotiation team. He works and interacts closely with the EU's diplomatic representatives in the occupied West Bank. In Tel Aviv, Ori Goldberg, an Israeli author, academic and political commentator. And in Beirut, Salman Sheikh, CEO of the Sheikh Group, an organisation working on diplomacy and mediation across the Middle East. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today on Inside Story. So I want to look at the context of this. I want to look at why the Israeli cabinet is doing this in a moment. But first, let's look at exactly what they've announced, Javier. 22 new settlements in the occupied West Bank. Some of these were outposts before. Some are completely new. How big a deal is this?
First of all, James, we have to be clear that this should not surprise anyone. What should surprise us is if the Israeli government announced that they are going to accept the two-state solution and move towards peace. The annexation of occupied Palestinian territory, the colonization of occupied Palestinian territory is part of the Israeli government platform. And let's not forget that we have now over 750,000 Israeli settlers all over the occupied Palestinian territory. They did not come only under the Netanyahu era. You are talking about government after government endorsing this position. So now the message, I think, is very clear. The Israeli government is telling everyone that they are not interested in following the international position on having a two-state solution or the prospects of an agreement. But once again, I think it's important to understand that this has not come overnight, and this is the consequence of decades that Israel has been allowed to do so.
So, Ori, we've heard there from Javier that this has been going on for years and years. But, I mean, the total number of settlements, as I understand it right now, is about 160 since 1967. So that's 160 in a 58-year period. And now they announce 22 all in one go.
Well, I think a major consideration here is the issue of domestic Israeli politics, and particularly the realization that is rapidly dawning on Israelis of all political stripes regarding Israel's massively diminished international stature at this point following its genocidal campaign in Gaza. Declaring 22 new settlements is a big deal. It is most definitely a part of a coherent, consistent strategy, but it is also a desperate move. It's also the only way the settlers, who are still holding on to influential political power, can make a statement, can stake a claim. I think the settlers are quite aware of the fact that come the next election cycle in Israel, and it's quite reasonable to assume it'll come sooner rather than later, their position in Israel and outside Israel will not allow them to do this as easily as they are doing so now. So it kind of seems paradoxical or oxymoronic to say, but the easier it is for the settlers to do now, the more it reeks of effort and desperation. And another thing, just to, in summary, it's true that this is consistent Israeli strategy, but the settlers have so far done this fairly discreetly and have managed to use the Israeli military to aid them and to basically turn all of the agencies of the Israeli state into accessories to the illegality that is the settlement. Declaring it in this way, blatantly, overtly, is also a sign of desperation. In that sense, it's a misstep. It's not akin to the strategies that have come so far. I think the people who are pushing this settlement initiative understand that they are on the verge, that this is a make or break moment. And I think most of them feel like it has a good chance of being a break moment rather than a make moment.
Salman, let's follow up on that point about how blatant it is about what they say they are doing. The two architects of this seem to be the far-right Defence Minister Israel Katz. He has said this is a strategic move that prevents the establishment of a Palestinian state that would endanger Israel. And the other one is the Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. He's called it a once-in-a-generation decision, next step, sovereignty. They are not disguising their motives here, are they?
No, and it reflects the nature of the Israeli settler nationalist government. We've already heard how the settlement enterprise has been going on for decades. Well, some of these gentlemen that you mentioned were on the fringes of Israeli politics. When I was in Israel in the early 2000s, they were very much on the fringes. But what we've seen is the coming together of this sort of hyper-Israeli nationalist trend along with the settlers. And that is now what is enabling them to push forward. I think it's only a misstep, by the way, if there is really strong pushback that has an effect on this Israeli nationalist settler government. I'm not convinced of that if we look at the inability so far to stop this enterprise.
OK, well, let's look, if we can, Javier, at where these settlements are and what it would mean for ordinary Palestinians, because it's already a Swiss cheese, isn't it, in the West Bank? There are detours and roadblocks and checkpoints and people who are farmers who are blocked off from their own fields. What would it actually mean if these 22 settlements formally came into being, and some of them are already there in some form and some are also being built as we speak?
We may want to say that those settlements are partially a reward to the settler movement, and I fully agree with what Ori said on that regard. Now, when you're looking at the map of the West Bank, I think it's important to look back also a few years ago. Because for a lot of time, we heard a talk from the international community about the need for Palestinians and Israelis to agree on swaps of territory, on border modifications. So eventually they would come and say, well, it's true Israel is building on the settlements, but it's not that problematic because then once you have an agreement, you can agree to exchange territory on one side or the other. Now, those 22 settlements make it totally impossible, even if someone was to agree to that perspective, to have an independent Palestinian state. Let's set clearly that all Israeli colonial settlements are illegal under international law. Never the international community should have tried to normalize any Israeli settlement in the occupied Palestinian territory. But if you look at where those 22 settlements are, I think it's a step right before annexation. If you look at where they are regarding the Jordan Valley in the border with Jordan, or, for example, you have settlements right deep into the Ramallah governorate, and, of course, in Nablus as well, that are main centers for Palestinian governance and economic activities. So I think the message is very clear from the Israeli government, but I would like to insist the design of the settlement enterprise and the settlements where they are located is not something new, and it goes alongside longest-standing Israeli policy to prevent the exercise of the Palestinian right to self-determination.
Salman, do you fear that an announcement on annexation of the West Bank might be imminent too?
It may well be as a tactic, but to be honest with you, James, the annexation project is now already leading to de facto annexation of the West Bank. Long gone has been the use of settlements as a bargaining in any negotiations for a final status agreement. What we've seen over the last few years, and certainly since this government came in late 2022, is a full-on move towards annexation. So annexation has been going on by stealth. An announcement would only just formally announce that, in my view, which is again why what we do about it now is extremely important. And let me also just add, we're talking about settlements. There are also hundreds of outposts out there, some of which are being legalized, which present an even more difficult picture in terms of Palestinian self-determination, contiguity of land, and ultimately a Palestinian state. All of that can also be normalized rather quickly. And then, yes, then everyone will know that this is annexation. But right now, as I've said, we've already got, in my view, an annexation which is going on by stealth.
Ori, tell us about the violence that is also accompanying all of this, because the UN figures are saying that settler violence, violence caused by Israeli settlers, is at the highest rate in at least 20 years. And perhaps you can also add for me the role of Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, because he's the finance minister, but he also has a role in the defence ministry. And some say he's the man who's running all of this. He's effectively become the governor of the West Bank.
Well, I'll start with your second question, James. That is most definitely the case. He is the minister in the Ministry of Defence responsible for all occupation matters, effectively. So, yes, he is running the show.
It used to be the military that ran this. But he is a minister in the Ministry of Defence who's sort of taken personal charge and tried to make this his fiefdom. Is that correct?
Yes, but the military has not been running this for some time. What we're seeing as far as violence goes is, and by the way, we're seeing this across the board in Israel and Israeli discourse with regard to Gaza, with regard to the West Bank. The quiet parts are being spoken out loud for decades, for a long time. Israelis, official Israelis, but also regular run-of-the-mill Israelis, would not talk about these things. The settlers gradually won control of the West Bank and used the military for their own nefarious purposes. But this was not spoken of. Now, the main difference following the almost 2-year genocidal campaign in Gaza is that all the quiet parts are spoken out loud. That's the difference. That's where the blatant tone comes from. That's where the aggression comes from. And Smotrich has absolutely no political livelihood if he is not able to say this as loudly and as clearly as he can. He knows this, by the way. He knows that this is the only moment where he can push this initiative forward and hope to get some kind of national support. But I would like to point out, continuing the points both Xavier and Salman made, it's true that de facto annexation is already very much in place. Israel is the occupying force in the territories, and it is gradually choking off Palestinian towns and villages with outposts, with roads where Palestinians are barred from traveling. But it is, since this is the reality, a great deal depends not on what is done to counter this settlement policy or this de facto annexation. A great deal depends on what is done towards Israel if the genocidal campaign in Gaza begins to taper off, if a ceasefire is reached, if there's a sense in the international community that Israel has overstayed its welcome. And I think that is what is heavy on the minds of the settlers and of their other right-wing friends in the Israeli government. There's a sense in Israel, it's a gradual one, but it exists, that the wheel is turning, that momentum is shifting. We're not talking about broad sanctions to be imposed by the United Nations Security Council, but we are talking about the European Union's High Commissioner for Sports suggesting that perhaps it's time to see whether Israel should continue to participate in European Confederation sporting events. These are things that, as far as Israelis are concerned, and remember, Israelis who in very large numbers support the genocide, support Israel's policy, these are things that are going to hurt Israelis exceedingly. I'm not even talking about flights into Israel and out of Israel. I'm not talking about boycotts in pretty much every aspect of life. But I think that the momentum is shifting. I think a lot more people are now trying to phrase a defense on where they were when Israel was doing its worst in its genocidal campaign. I think this is the most important part. It's not fighting the settlements specifically. The settlements are a symptom. The settlements demonstrate Israel's strength, but they also demonstrate Israel's great despair. Israel has absolutely nothing to do but to go for broke. The question is, will the world counter this?
OK, well, Javier, answer that question. What levers does the international community have? Let me start you off, perhaps, with the legal system. We know this is illegal. It's an occupation, and they are illegally occupying these settlements. It's always been illegal. We even know last year the top court in the UN system, the International Court of Justice, said Israel's continued presence in the whole of the occupied Palestinian territory was unlawful. Is there any recourse to law, or is that not the right way to go?
I think it's very important to move ahead with the legal systems, but it's not the only issue. I mean, we have legal actions, we have political actions that can be taken and should be taken. We're talking about settlements being part of a colonial settlement enterprise, which goes beyond just houses being built, as you have been presenting here in Al Jazeera. Now, there is a case of the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice was very clear that this is illegal, and that provides responsibilities for states. And now I think the big challenge that quote-unquote liberal democracies have is that they are being confronted with the reality that they cannot longer avoid taking action. Just a few days ago, the Israeli government sent messages to some European governments threatening that if they recognize Palestine in a few weeks in the context of the UN of the conference that will take place in New York on saving the two-state solution. If they recognize Palestine, they may annex part or the entirety of the occupied West Bank. Well, the response to this should be, well, if you do that, there will be sanctions, even though I believe sanctions should be placed now. So there is one element, I think, James, which is very important that you have highlighted with regards to courts, not just international courts, there are local courts. Let's remember that a lot of the funding for those settlements comes from organizations working worldwide, collecting money, including, for example, the Israel Land Fund or the Jewish National Fund. And in addition to that, there is, of course, political action, like, for example, announcing arms embargoes and other elements that I think nowadays several governments are considering to take action on.
Salman, Ori was talking about he thinks things are changing. You've certainly got some countries throughout this who've been very critical of what Israel has been doing. For example, Brazil, Russia, China, but some European countries, Spain, Norway, Slovenia. Are you seeing things changing now with some of the big Western countries? We've had statements recently from the UK, from France, Canada. Are these words, or are they going to actually lead to action?
Well, I think the jury's out, very, very honestly with you. Yes, the rhetoric has got stronger. But, you know, I remember going on this media channel in November 2023 and talking about us not thinking about a day after in Gaza, because I just didn't believe that the international community would act forcefully enough. And that, particularly talking to diplomats and officials in various European and Western governments, the question of proportionality, the question of using aid and humanitarian access as a weapon, the question of targeted killings, arbitrary arrests, they were all in the minds of diplomats and officials at the end of 2023, for sure. But what happened? Nothing. What we've seen now is the continuation of a genocide, which doesn't show any sign of really stopping, even if we get a temporary ceasefire in the next day or two. So to bring it back to the West Bank, are we going to see a determined international response? And here, James, I wonder whether we're looking through the looking glass. Why is it that this particular situation doesn't allow powerful states that, on the face of it, support international law and the international system and are constantly worried about it collapsing, and of course point to other situations, rightfully in my view, such as Ukraine, but are not able to apply the measures, the toolkit that does exist in international diplomacy when it comes to Israel and this particular Israeli government? And I do want to make that distinction. Until they are really serious about that, we are going to see annexation, and I'm not entirely convinced that we will see a strong enough, robust response either to avert it or in order to reverse it. And that should deeply worry us all, because that won't stay with regards to the Israeli-Palestinian situation. That is something which will have a further knock-on effect in terms of the international system.
Javier, why do you think we are detecting a change in recent weeks from some of these big Western powers? Do they feel they're going to end up on the wrong side of history? Do they have, they've not declared it to us, but do they have legal assessments, their own legal assessments they're looking at? Or is it the media coverage? Because we've seen the most horrific things in Gaza now for more than 600 days. But of course, there have been some really awful things. For example, the case of Dr. Ala al-Najjar, the doctor in Gaza who had 9 of her children killed in a strike there. What do you think has changed things?
Unfortunately, James, I would like to start by saying that everything we are seeing from the international community now, or from Western countries in particular, is too little too late for the magnitude of what we are going through, even though we have to understand that there is a change as you are presenting. And I think it's a combination of the three factors you have presented. There are legal obligations, and therefore they don't want to be seen as complicit in neither with a genocide nor with a colonial settlement enterprise. But there is, I think, a very important element with regards to public opinion. People have been going out to the streets, they have demonstrated, and it's very difficult now to defend whatever Israel is doing. Why would people not support, for example, cases in the International Criminal Court on the issue of colonization in the occupied West Bank, not just on the genocide that's going on in Gaza, or the war crimes and crimes against humanity, as, for example, Mr. Netanyahu is being wanted now. So, yeah, there is an important change internationally. I think it's important to push for concrete actions, because even though we can see a change, we haven't seen concrete measures yet. And we understand from the Israeli government positions that if you don't take actions, concrete measures, we will continue to see ethnic cleansing and annexation as official policies of the State of Israel.
OK, Salman, we have this meeting coming up in New York, 17th of June onwards, in the UN General Assembly, about recognition of a Palestinian state. Clearly, we know that those who have pushed through these new settlements want to kill the idea of a Palestinian state. How important is this meeting, and do you think any of those big countries are going to change their position and recognise a Palestinian state? I think in particular of the UK, France, Germany and Canada. Do you see any change with any of those nations?
I hope so. I mean, on the show so far, I've been fairly pessimistic, but I must say this particular meeting and the whole debate around recognition of a Palestinian state, in my view, is one of the last best chances that the international community have in putting a stake in the ground and recognizing a Palestinian state. And in that respect, I think the pressure is on actually the UK government, the UK and the French government. The UK and the French are permanent members of the UN Security Council. The French and President Macron has already indicated that he is going in that direction. Well, this is a time for the UK to join that movement, and also for countries like Canada, which were part of an earlier announcement promising concrete actions, to also get behind this. I doubt we'll see that from Germany, but we've also seen more clear statements from the new Chancellor Merz in that regard as well. I think it's very, very important that these countries, particularly the UK and France, push forward with this. And in that respect, I think you will create a robust coalition of the willing, which is both Europe and the Arab states, as well as the rest of the world, that says enough is enough. If we fail to do that, and the public debate inside the UK, for example, does not push the leadership there, then we will have a problem. Let me just finally say on this, I'm a member of the UK Labour Party. I have been a supporter and even a donor of the UK Labour Party. I remember when a previous Labour government supported an illegal war in Iraq. If we miss this opportunity, I believe that we will have an enduring and continuing problem with the Middle East as a party within the UK. And I think that cannot continue. And certainly it will make a lot of Labour members and supporters of this government extremely uncomfortable.
Thank you, Salman, and thank you to our guests today, Xavier Abu Eid, Ori Goldberg and Salman Sheikh. Stay tuned to Al Jazeera for continuing coverage of the war on Gaza and the situation in the occupied West Bank, and you'll find plenty more analysis and context on our website, aljazeera.com. Your comments are welcome as ever. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or we can be found on X. Look for @AJ Inside Story. I'll be back here very soon. But until next time, from me, James Bays, and the team here in Doha, stay safe. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.